I am so excited to be here with you, Valerie. You and I have been friends since graduate school, and I was very happy to find out that you were writing this book, because I was hoping that you would have figured out what matters and that you would be able to tell me. But it turns out, now that I've read the book, that telling people what matters isn't actually your goal in this book. So I'm wondering if we could start by you just telling us, what is your goal in the book? What is the book about?
Sure. And let me also say, I'm so happy you agreed to do this, because it's just so nice to be in conversation with somebody I like and respect. And before I tell you about the book, I really want to say hello to all the Canadians, because I grew up in Toronto. I see a whole bunch of my compatriots there and from other towns in Ontario. My mom lives in Cobourg, so I'm often in the Toronto area. Anyway, so the book is based on the work that I was, the more academic work I was doing on well-being and thinking about well-being in terms of value fulfillment, as Anthony mentioned. The basic idea is we human beings have a lot of goals, and those goals from the very lofty, like have children or get married or have a career as a lawyer, to the very particular, floss every day, stop eating cheesecake. We've got this huge range of goals, and those goals invariably conflict with each other. And when they do, we experience frustration, disappointment, major unhappiness. So goal conflict, especially between those higher level, more important goals, is a great source of frustration and unhappiness for people. And lots of the causes of conflict are things we can't do much about. I mean, sometimes the world just doesn't allow us to do things that we want to do. But we do have some control over this process of trying to meet our goals and experiencing the conflict. So there are things that we can, in other words, we can do our part, even though the world might frustrate us in certain respects. And one thing we can do is to make sure we have the right goals, to make sure we have goals that line up with the things that are most important to us. And those are what I call our values. So I take values to be a very special kind of goal that's important to you and that fits you psychologically. So those very important goals that match who you are as a person, that mesh well with your sense of, with your emotions, with your judgments, with your desires. Those are our values. And one of the things we can do is make sure that all the goals we have are aligned with those important values. Sometimes our goals kind of are misfiring and they don't line up with anything that's actually important. Then I think the other bit that's, part of the stuff that we can do about this situation is we can recognize conflicts when they happen. Recognizing the conflict is helpful because it can help us sort out what's really at stake in this conflict, what really matters here. And understanding our goal conflicts in that way can help us figure out how to resolve the conflict. Then the last thing I'll say is that all this talk in the book about my goals and my values and what's good for me can make it sound like a very individualistic sort of picture. But it's really important to me that other people and our social nature matters tremendously to how well we are able to fulfill our own goals. And that's partly because we value other people. We value the people in our family. We value our friends. And so other people are essentially just enmeshed in all the goals that we have in one way or another. So it can sound individualistic, but that's a bit of a false impression.
Thank you. There's so much to talk about there. And I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you more about this. So my first question for you is, I guess, a pretty big one, a pretty basic one, which is, how do we go about figuring out what our values are, like identifying these high level goals that you're calling values? Because it's not like they show up in neon lights in front of us. So what's the process that we go through, or that we can go through, to be able to identify those?
So I think, in fact, to some extent, people do know what their values are, in the sense that if you ask them on surveys, which psychologists do, we say stuff. We have answers to those questions. So people will say that they value family, friendship, health, security, career success. If you prompt them a little bit, people will talk about valuing autonomy, just not the Kantian notion, Karen, but just, having some choice, some like liberty in their life. So I think we're not completely ignorant about the things that are important to us at a great level of generality, this sort of like vaguely stated family. I think what we do need help with is getting more specific about what those values really mean and how they compare to each other. So which one takes priority, which one is more important when they come in conflict with each other. And I have a chapter on the book where I talk about a number of strategies for understanding your values better. And I guess, without going into too much detail, the theme of that chapter is really that we tend to think that all we need to do is just introspect. So just sit and think really hard, and you'll know what your values are and what they mean to you. But because values are they're almost like ideal goals that fit who we are psychologically, there are parts of us that we don't always see when we just sit and think. So I think our emotional responses to things are very important to what our values are and what really matters to us. And sometimes, if all we do is sit and introspect and think, what do I care about and how do I care about it, we miss the emotional dimension. So I think strategies like actually trying to take a kind of third person perspective on yourself, trying to see yourself as a friend would see you, to find out, well, how am I reacting to things? How did, I tried a new activity. How did I respond to it? Did it bring me joy or put me in a state of flow, or was I bored out of my head? So we can take that perspective on ourselves, but we can also actually ask friends. And if we have good friends who are, capable of observing and communicating in a respectful way, sometimes friends can let us know that, there's this thing you've been doing for years, which I don't really think is working for you. So that I suppose is the major theme about how to figure out what our values are in more detail.
So we can't just be philosophers and like sit around and think.
No.
Darn. All right. Question for you then. So I was thinking, when you were talking like the survey, putting them down, I mean, so often like we put stuff down because we think it's supposed to be what we value. Like I just imagine, like if you didn't put down friends or family, like your actual friends and family would probably be mad at you. Like, what do you mean you don't value me? You're not going to put down like trivial stuff that you do that maybe isn't very important. How much do you think that our like statement, like, yeah, this is what I value, actually reflects what we do value? Or do you think there may be some self-deception involved, or some confusion perhaps about our own values? Or maybe I think self-deception is really what I'm wondering about. Do you think we ever just are like, it's like, yes, I really value this, but it turns out we actually don't?
Yeah, in fact, that I think is the self-deception is often the cause of not listening to your emotional dispositions. So, the sort of cognitive judgy part of our brains spins great stories about why so-and-so, like, just for example, why it's important to make a lot of money. And so, that part of ourselves, it takes over when we make decisions, moves us into a career path where we're going to make more money. But it turns out that the rest of us, like the things that we enjoy doing and the things that bring us some sense of accomplishment and purpose and a feeling of pride, those emotions haven't been listened to. And so that self-deceptive narrative about, yeah, this is the career you want because you'll make lots of money doing this, can really lead us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and that one in particular, I think often leads people in the wrong direction. And maybe it's because they haven't thought that much about it. Like, okay, I really want a well-paying job, and it might be so they can pay back loans or travel or something, but sometimes it's not even something that people reflect on. And so is my right thinking part of your idea is that by sort of thinking more sort of clearly and sort of not just like sitting in a chair and doing that, but by really reflecting on what our values are, like, what do I want money for? What is it doing for me? That's helpful to us in understanding what role money plays or anything else plays in our overall structure of values.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I guess the money example is a little complicated because, excuse me, money has such tremendous instrumental value. And so there are lots of reasons to want to make more money because it can help you do all the other things that you care about. But I think where we can go wrong and where self-deception enters the picture is you can convince yourself that a lucrative career path is the best for you in terms of what will actually make you happy and proud of yourself and feel fulfilled. Because that path is an easy cultural narrative that everybody understands, it makes sense, but it could be that it's led you away from the things that, in fact, given what you're like in other dimensions, bring you these good feelings. So I don't want to be, it sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish to say, you shouldn't care about money. And I actually think some of the psychological research on money there's controversy about, you'll see these headlines that say money doesn't make you happy past a certain, $75,000 a year in American culture. And once you earn that much, there's no happiness benefits. It turns out that's pretty controversial, actually. And psychologists think, well, it depends on how you measure the happiness. And if what you're looking at is people's satisfaction with their lives, it just keeps going up the more money you make. So that's complicated. But I do think that the allure of money often has people doing things that aren't making them feel good. What do you think about self-deception as a Kantian? Do you think from the Kantian perspective, is it rampant or?
Rampant, I'd say, making it difficult for us to see what we care about or value. This idea that our motivational structure is kind of opaque to us. So I was thinking about this, like how we value things and like what we know about what we value. Because lots of people do value money for different kinds of reasons and may kid themselves, I guess, about how much they value. But then it's also hard to know why. I think for a lot of people, the money is also tied to security. So it's not like, oh, I want this money so I can go do this. It's having, a certain amount of money in your bank account gives you a sense of like feeling like, okay, I can pay for this disaster, like the car breakdown or whatever it is. And that, makes sense. Security seems like something really important.
Right. And money is also related to being able to care for your children and give them the things that you want them to have. So you're right. But I think people are better off acknowledging that money. I think honestly, when I talk to my students, it's sometimes news to them that money is instrumentally valuable. They're young, granted, but they think about making money as so important that they think about it as the end goal. And I think that's one of these places where actually philosophy helps, and having some clarity about the kinds of values these are is quite helpful. Because if you acknowledge that money is instrumentally valuable, then your sense of worth is not attached to how much money you make, but how much you're able to do the things that actually matter, that money is just a means to. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I guess for Kant, the part of our motivational structure, it's like what we're deceived about is our moral behavior, right? I mean, that we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, morally speaking.
Yeah, that we tend to convince ourselves, tell ourselves a nice story about why we're doing it. Oh, well, I'm in this job because of whatever, without realizing that it's doing something else entirely. I think that's one of the dangers. And I can see that happening with our values too. Like we convince ourselves, oh, I don't really value money, because it sounds bad to value money, but it turns out you do. And so I guess that some of it is also, I guess, about sort of learning to be at home within yourself in some ways, like this is who I am and this is what I value. That could be empowering.
It's interesting because it doesn't seem, college students don't seem to mind at all saying that they value money. It's my college students. When I ask them, what do they want from a career? That is the first thing they say. I want to make a lot of money.
Yeah. And then I wonder if you ask why, sort of the beginning of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, why do you value that thing? Why do you value money? And that's where the hard part comes in. What is it that money says to you? Is it like a marker of outside success? It makes your parents proud of you. It makes you feel like you belong in a society that places a lot of value on the trappings of wealth. So
exactly. And I guess that's the kind of clarity I think is important for navigating conflicts. Because if when you end up, you move on in life and you end up having a choice between different jobs or different paths, and one maybe has a little bit more financial reward, but the other one's much more satisfying. If you haven't figured out why money matters to you, it'll be hard for you to understand the trade-offs of that choice.
Yeah. Or choose well, like choose in a way that's going to benefit you. And I'm glad you mentioned conflicts, because my next question is actually about resolving conflicts. So let's suppose that we've managed to identify our values and some of our goals, but these things, it's not going to work out perfectly because the world's going to present us with choices, or we're going to have to make decisions. So in chapter 4, you talk about a number of different strategies for resolving conflicts among our values. And one of those you call reinterpretation. I think that's really interesting. So I wonder if you could tell us more about what reinterpretation is and how you think it can help us resolve conflicts.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the places where, even though we know what we want in broad terms, I want to be a good parent or a good spouse or a good friend or a good teacher or whatever. My dogs are barking. I was concerned that might happen. We must have a delivery. I think we don't know essentially what it means to be good at those things, or to have those things, or to fulfill those values. And so there's room for interpretation. Like being a good parent means a lot of different things to different people. I have some friends who, if they are not like baking cupcakes from scratch for the bake sale and sewing all the Halloween costumes from knitting them themselves and driving their kids to 7 different lessons in the week, they feel like a failure as a parent. And then I have other friends who are sort of like, hey, my kid's alive and passing her classes. Yay, me, I'm a great parent. So, people have these very different standards. So one thing we can do when goals conflict, and even when these higher order important values conflict, is rethink how we're interpreting what success means in terms of those values. I think like the case of a career over a lifetime, or work over a span of time is a good example. So it's a good example of how the way that you interpret your value should change as your life changes. You know, when you're in your 20s and 30s, it can make good sense to think in terms of milestones. Like, I want to get this kind of job, I want a promotion, I want to be maybe even earning this much money because I need it for X, Y, and Z. Then when you get to sort of mid-career, you'll see that, you know, you were successful in some of those things and not successful in others, but you have to start thinking differently. Typically, most people have to start thinking differently than hitting the next milestone. You might start thinking about contributing to a team or mentoring other people who are coming up in your profession. Or you might start thinking about scaling back a little bit on work because you have family who need you or hobbies you'd like to pursue. And then when you get towards retirement, once again, success in your work, I think it could be reasonable to think about success in work in terms of, you know, I worked for this corporation or this law firm or this institution or whatever, and that institution did some good for the world, and I contributed my little drop in the bucket, and that's a good thing. Rather than thinking, as you may have done when you were quite young, you know, I'm going to change the world and be ambitious. And that's fine when you're young. But then when you get close to retirement, you have to start thinking differently about it. So that's what I mean by reinterpretation. It's the rethinking of what success means, essentially, or what fulfillment means.
So sometimes it seems, I mean, that seems right about so many things, like where the reinterpretation suggests like a gain in wisdom. And I was thinking about this, like, I think, you know, I had all kinds of ideas about what being a good parent would be like and all kinds of visions and all this. And then like the actual kids came into my life. I was like, yeah, that's not going to work. And that's wisdom, right? Because you don't really know. Sometimes like, I don't know what this is going to be like. And then as you gain some wisdom, you're like, oh, this is what it is to succeed in this sphere and on that. But then sometimes that isn't really wisdom. Sometimes it's just like settling when we shouldn't. How do we tell the difference between reinterpretation that reflects a better grip on what success should really be like or what it should be like for me, and reinterpretation that is just me settling for less when I could have actually achieved more and come closer to sort of achieving the things that I care about?
Right. That's a great question. And it's a really hard question. And I don't actually think that there's a kind of principled one-stop answer for that. So I think it's going to depend a lot on the details of the case. I mean, I think to some extent, the values that we have impose some constraints on how much we can reinterpret them. So when it comes to parenting, you can't reinterpret being a good parent as letting your kids starve or not giving them clothes or not sending them to school. Those standards are just not acceptable for the value of parenting. So I think the values themselves impose some limits on how much you can reinterpret. I also think that most of us are motivated to, well, it's actually isn't it called the Aristotelian principle that we, is that what it's called? Well, you'll know better than I, but that we tend to adapt to things and get bored. And so people are always, curious and moving forward. So I think there is some sort of aspect of human nature that prevents us from truly settling with something that's just much below what we could do. So how did it work in your case with parenting? I mean, I presume you don't feel like you settled.
No, except insofar as everyone does. But I mean, I think it's also this that recognition that some of your ideas are just unrealistic, which is common when you start out on something and you don't know. You're like, yes, I will be the parent who does X, Y, and Z. And you're like, actually, no. Or my kid doesn't even want me to do this. I was laughing at the Halloween costumes. Like, I valued making Halloween costumes, but my kids just wanted the Target one. And then I was like, we're all happier this way. But I mean, some of that I think is like getting more realistic or concrete goals. Like, what can I actually achieve? And maybe when the costs become clearer to you, be like, well, I could do that, but it's going to take away from this other thing that I also care about. But I was wondering, like, going back to like the example of success, because I find this really interesting. You and I work in a field that still doesn't have a lot of women in it, or not as many as might. And I think, you know, one of the many challenges that people face, not just women, but in a lot of different fields, is this question, like, is what I have really enough? Like, we might settle just because it's simpler or safer, or because we're sort of, I don't know, socialized not to rock the boat or to be pleasant, and doing something else would mean, you know, upsetting things, but in a way that isn't bad, but like where maybe we value, you know, stability or security too much and won't take chances. And then I could see reinterpretation working against it. You could reinterpretation, like, actually, I'm totally happy with this situation, where maybe you really aren't, or you're kidding yourself, or you shouldn't be happy with the situation.
Yeah. So one thing about, I mean, the obstacle of sexism is something I talk about in the book, because I have personal experience with it, as I'm sure do you. And I think there's a difference between, this is a slight avoiding your question, but your question's really hard, so I'm gonna do it anyway. There's a difference between obstacles that are unmovable, and that it just, the rational thing to do by every light is to get used to it. You know, like with my eyesight and being diabetic, I was never going to be an astronaut. That just, no. I mean, I could have wanted that till the cows come home, and I would never have been selected. But sexism and other kinds of prejudice right now, those are obstacles that are changeable, and that it can make sense to value changing them. So the way I think about those sorts of social obstacles is that you can actually make your values more coherent by acknowledging that this is an obstacle, which I think is unjust and unfair and bad, and it would actually increase the coherence in my values if I not only don't just let it dictate what I see myself as able to do, but if I also take it to be one of my goals to change those structures. Now, that's a little bit idealistic, because sometimes, I mean, often people who are the victims of those kinds of social prejudices and constraints are not in a position to change it. But, you know, sometimes we are. I mean, now you and I are in some sort of positions of authority, and can work against the kind of sexism in our career path that affected us as we were moving through it. So that's, I mean, that's a very specific answer to your question. The more general question about what if you settle for something less, and it wasn't, you know, it would have been better for you to strive more. You know, in a way, as I might have expected, you're sort of pushing me to try to be more objective, and to have a kind of, like, we could imagine Aristotle here saying, well, but a good human life is this. And so if you settle for something less than that, you're blowing it. And of course, I don't have an objective conception of the human good or the best human life. And so for me, it's always going to be like, I think there are some people who would be better off if they settled more, and some people who will be better off by striving more. And it's going to depend on what they're like psychologically, which is why there's not a principled answer.
Yeah. Yeah, well, setting aside the whole question about the objectivity, which there's lots to say about, but it sounds like you think that it might be like, even like internally, like thinking about okay, that it might be that it's best for me to like sort of push back on something because I really do value it, even though it's going to be sort of unpleasant or difficult now, because this is more in line with what I really care about in ways that I can sort of see by my own lights and my own values. Like one way to, so it might be that you resolve the conflict, but like, I can't do anything about this, or the emotional toll for this is so high that it's not worth it. Like it'll be bad for me. Or it might be like, no, this is actually worth a fight I can take on and I want to take on, because in, you know, looking back in 5 years or 10 years or 20, I'll be glad I did this, which I always think is an interesting perspective too. You know, when you like, is this something that will still matter? Will you be glad you did this? And often that like push the boundaries a bit more is something we're very often glad we did, particularly when it works.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even on that side of things where you're thinking, I'll be glad that I did this in 5 years. I'm gonna this will be my fight. There are different ways of interpreting what it means to succeed in the fight. So you can think, you know, it was worth it if I changed the law or changed the institution. Those are high standards, but you could also think it was worth it if I moved the needle just a little bit. I helped a few other people who have struggled to get farther than they would have gotten otherwise. So even there, I think there's room for thinking about what it means to be successful in bucking the trend.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Or even just standing up for your values, even if you know it's not going to work, that might be valuable to you. Being like, you know, I acted in a way that reflected what I cared about.
Exactly. It gives you, so you're sort of expressing your integrity by doing that.